In this lecture, I will discuss the demise of the Old Kingdom, coming after a period of 700 years of prosperity and success. We will see the end of pyramid building on a grand scale, and then the end of pyramid building altogether. We will discover what brought the Old Kingdom to its knees, something that I think might come as a surprise to you, and the chaotic conditions that were perhaps expedited by the longest rule of any monarch in history, an unbelievable 94 years, which helped lead to the collapse of government when confronted by the greatest disaster in Egyptian history. This will be followed by a span of time known today as the First Intermediate Period. Then from the ashes of that chaos, we will witness the rise of the so-called Middle Kingdom, and the reestablishment of pharaonic rule over the entire valley after nearly a century and a half of anarchy and mob rule. And we will meet the very first female pharaoh. And then we will see the end of the Middle Kingdom after a span of 500 years, brought to an end by the onslaught of a foreign invader, a people still little understood today that came from across the Sinai Desert from the area of Canaan, and the establishment of a 200-year period under their rule of what has come to be called the Second Intermediate Period. So, let's take a look at this little-known era of Egyptian history that also includes the creation of a very strange story that biblical and secular scholars still debate today. In this lecture, I wish to discuss the demise of the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom comprised primarily the 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties. Remember, a dynasty is the rule by a single family. Now, it's during this period of time that we're going to see that grand pyramid building ended with Menkaure. Pyramid building will continue, certainly, but not on a grand scale. Pyramids will continue to be built for hundreds of years, but it won't be anything like what we've seen with the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. In fact, Menkaure's successor, an individual by the name of Shepseskaf, was the last pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, and he didn't even build on the Giza Plateau, but he built at Saqqara. That's the location of the stepped pyramid. So let's just move down here for a moment and take a look at his funeral architecture. There you see it. Okay, it's kind of hard to even discern, but what we can tell is that it wasn't even a pyramid. It was just a gigantic mastaba. And by a huge mastaba, I do mean huge. And so what we see here with the scale of the person standing there next to it, and then here is the opening into the burial chamber. This is a very large but atypical kind of structure for a pharaoh, especially given the history of pyramid building up to this time. We don't know why he's built a mastaba here, but we can always speculate that maybe it's a lack of resources or going back to tradition, who knows really. But one thing that's interesting about his mastaba is that the opening that you see here leads down to the burial chamber. So one thing that this mastaba didn't have that the earlier ones did have was that vertical burial shaft leading down to the burial chamber. This one has a more complex arrangement of structures underground that is more akin to what we see with the pyramids. In any case, in the beginning of the 5th dynasty, kings begin building temples that have never before been seen in Egypt. So let's fly down here and just see the remains of one of these, sitting on the western verge of the Nile River. There you can discern just barely the complex surrounding the temple, and then some structures here that were the base of the temple. So that's the footprint of it right there, and here is what remains of it today. Now these are solar temples. Interesting structures because we've never seen anything like this in previous eras of Egyptian history, and we're really not going to see any like this later either. But the thing that's significant about it is it's a solar temple. In other words, it's an indication of the growth during the Old Kingdom period, the 5th dynasty, of worship of the solar deity Ra or Re. So what these are huge obelisks of stone-built masonry. So it's not an obelisk made of a single shaft of granite like we'll see later, but is instead built of ashlar masonry, and then capped with a gold-covered benben symbol at its summit. So here you can see the pedestal upon which the shaft sits, the obelisk itself sits. And so they got the remains of the pedestal here, and then what remains of the base of the shaft itself. So this is an indication that for the first time in the history of Egypt, we got a god by the name of Re or Ra, who is a sun god, and had been around for a long time. But it's only during this period of time that he becomes arguably the most important deity in all of Egypt. And this is indicated by the fact that the royal names during this dynasty begin to include his name in their name as an indication of their allegiance. Now, this is usually the case with Egyptian pharaohs, is that for their royal name, they'll take a name and then they'll amend to it the name of the deity to whom they owe allegiance. So Ramses, for example, who places the name at the beginning, Ra-Meses, as we've talked about before, taken from Ra, we see that here if you look at this list of names, Sahu-Re, okay, Neferirka-Re, Shepseska-Re, Neferer-Re, Niasu-Re, and Jetkare. So all their names end in the name of the deity to whom they owe greatest allegiance, indicating the rise and power of this particular religious observance. All right, it's during the 5th dynasty also that we see Unas, who was the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty. Now obviously I'm not covering all the pharaohs of the dynasties here. We don't have time to do that. There's lots of pharaohs. And so I'm just selecting those where we either have an introduction of something new or something important, or a pharaoh that accomplishes something significant during his lifetime. So in the case of Unas, he's the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, and he introduces what we refer to today as the pyramid texts. So you can see here his pyramid. It's in really bad condition, as you can see. So certainly nothing like the grand pyramids, needless to say. But nearby is the stepped pyramid, so it's in that general vicinity. It's not on the Giza Plateau. But what Unas introduces, this pyramid text you see here, and that is, here's the burial chamber, and you can see that its walls are completely covered with hieroglyphics. By the way, just a note, the ceiling here, this gabled ceiling, is covered with stars. And so originally that would have been painted blue with gold stars representing the heavens, of course. So why hieroglyphs on the walls of the burial chamber? Well, this is where we see the first inclusion of hieroglyphs in a pyramid's burial chamber. Like I mentioned when I was talking about the Great Pyramid, prior to this period of time, there was really no attempt, apparently, to decorate these burial chambers. But with Unas, we get the introduction of hieroglyphs in a pyramid. And what are those hieroglyphs? Magical texts from the Book of the Dead that are meant to protect the pharaoh during his journey into the afterlife. So from this time onward, we're going to see a decoration of royal burial chambers, including hieroglyphs, texts from the Book of the Dead, and a variety of other texts showing up on the walls of these burial chambers from this time onward. So let's take a look at the 6th dynasty. And here, certainly no more grand pyramid building. In fact, as you can see in this pyramid here, you can hardly even discern that that's a pyramid at all. So the pyramids begin to be very cheaply built, mostly mud brick structures, and not even being made of stone, but rather mud brick. So what does this imply? Well, it implies that the pharaohs are no longer capable of perhaps building these grandiose pyramids and have to resort to something much cheaper and more quickly built. So this pharaoh by the name of Teti has an example of one of these types of pyramids. He built a very poor one for his burial site, and let's move down to take a look at it right here on the banks, on the western banks of the Nile River, next to the agricultural zone, of course. And as you look at this complex, again, it's kind of hard to even see anything here, but this complex of structures right here, well, that's not his pyramid. It's this right here. You can hardly even discern it. So there's his pyramid. And as we look at it from ground level, there it is there. And you can see again, very, very poorly built, made of very cheap materials. So indicates that perhaps the pharaohs of this era simply don't have the resources anymore, which would be indicative of a decline if the building of pharaonic burial structures is not up to par. That would suggest that something has gone awry in Egyptian society. But interestingly enough, if you look right next to it here on this right side of the photograph, you see the corner of the structure here. That's a mastaba. And that's a mastaba that was built by his vizier or advisor, Mereruka. And so here's another view of that mastaba, plus my cutaway view of the floor plan, featuring the 32 rooms of which this mastaba consisted. Well, you can see that it's a very extravagant and grandiose burial structure, as opposed to his master, the pharaoh's pyramid, which looks absolutely shabby by comparison to it. So it makes you wonder what's going on during this period of time. But the thing that's interesting about Mereruka's mastaba here, not only is it very complex, its walls feature some of the most beautiful artwork ever created in Egypt. So let's take a look at a couple of the panels here. So you can see that the walls are extensively covered with carvings and inscriptions. Then note over here a false doorway leading into the afterlife. So there's Mereruka stepping forth into the afterlife, or moving into the afterlife. Nevertheless, what I want you to look at here is the carving, featuring some of the most lavish and finest reliefs ever created, not just of this era, but of any era. So we've talked about before the fact that the Egyptian artist was fairly adept with realism when allowed to work with animals or lower forms of life. And you can see that, I think, fairly well evidenced in this hippopotamus here. That's fairly realistically depicted, and that crocodile behind him. Even more so in this image of the bull. This is, I think, just a magnificent depiction of this bull being led off to sacrifice or whatever, but nevertheless, look how beautiful the bull is, and realistically depicted. On the other hand, the humans, of course, are still follow the same iconic canon of proportion and canon of drawing that we've seen in the past. But in any case, Mereruka's mastaba features some of the most beautiful reliefs ever carved in Egypt. So again, evidence of the fact that while the pharaonic office, the pharaonic coffers are perhaps diminishing, Mereruka, the vizier, he seems to be replete with wealth and is able to lavish that wealth on his burial chambers. So then virtually the last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom is a fellow by the name of Pepe II. Now notice, he reigned for 94 years. Considered to be the longest reign of any monarch in world history. Died at the age of 98, and so obviously that tells us that he began ruling when he was just a child of 4 years old. So here in this image we see him sitting on the lap of either his wet nurse or perhaps his mother, but obviously a small child sitting on her lap. So he began ruling as a child, probably under a regent, of course, until he became old enough to make mature decisions on his own, but then goes on and rules for 94 years. Now, Pepe II will be the penultimate ruler of the Old Kingdom, meaning the second to the last. His son will rule after him, but only for 1 year. So the implication there, of course, is that Pepe rules so long, lives for so long, that his heir is a very old man by the time he comes to the throne, and is able to rule for only a year before he dies. Now, the whole end of this dynasty is somewhat shrouded in mystery because conditions begin to deteriorate fairly quickly in the Old Kingdom at this time. Now, one scholar suggested that perhaps this deterioration and the demise of the Old Kingdom was perhaps encouraged by the fact that Pepe was just too old to lead Egypt effectively. And of course, his son was old also to live very long to maintain an effective rule. Some evidences of the Old Kingdom's decline at this period of time, in addition to the poorly constructed pyramids, began to appear during his rule. So, for example, he seemed to allow the army to diminish in strength, allowing instead the nobles, or the so-called nomarchs, those noble individuals who governed sections of territory along the Nile, he allowed them to gain more and more power at the expense of his own power. Now, during his reign, an ecological disaster also strikes Egypt. It's a bad coinciding of events that occur here that's going to bring about the demise of the Old Kingdom. So an ecological disaster strikes Egypt, and perhaps as a result of the conditions that Pepe allowed to occur during his reign, it brings about the end of the kingdom. And so whatever happens is well expressed in this line from an Egyptian poem of the time, in which it is stated, "What is made has been unmade." Now, what do they mean by that? Well, basically, the weakness of the government under Pepe, who was not apparently very capable of handling difficult situations as it arose, this weak government could not handle the ecological crisis that occurs, and it results in the total collapse of government and society. In fact, after Pepe's son, pharaohs disappear from the records. This is indicated by the fact that there are no more royal portraits, and pharaohs typically are going to have portraits made of themselves, and if there are none, then this would imply that there are no more pharaohs. The records certainly don't contain any information about pharaohs. However, what does happen is that local warlords and gangs will take over the Nile Valley. And so they will basically supplant any pharaoh, any royal power that might try to arise is suppressed by local warlords and gang leaders who take over Egypt. So we have no record of pharaohs for the next 126 years. So no more great pharaohs like Khafre are going to be present in Egypt during this period of time, which is referred to as the First Intermediate Period. So they're gone. In their place, anarchy prevails. No more centralized law and order. It is during this period of time that all of the pre-dynastic and Old Kingdom tombs were looted, broken into and emptied of their treasures, without fear of reprisal. Now, when people talk about Egyptian tombs being looted, the question that obviously comes to mind is that how did that happen? I mean, when pharaohs built these things, they meant them to last forever, for eternity. There were guards that were present in these royal funerary complexes. In order to break into a tomb and loot it of its treasures, the looters had to have pretty free rein to do what they wanted to. How could they do that and not be apprehended if there were guards that were present? And the point is that there were no guards present, because society and government had completely collapsed. And so these tombs were free game. Anyone that could organize a looting party was free to open the tombs and remove all of the treasure. And so all of the tombs of the Old Kingdom and the pre-dynastic era, all those mastabas and so on, all of those were opened and looted during this period of time. All right, so that helps us answer the question of what happened. Why is it that we keep talking about the fact that there were no tombs that were unlooted by the time we get to the modern era? Well, those had been looted before we even got 100 years past the Old Kingdom. Everything was gone. So all of the efforts that had gone into the building of these great pyramids, the attempt to ensure the survivability of their bodies and of their treasures into the eternities, all went for naught. Because it's during this period of time, which lasted for 126 years approximately, over a century, almost a century and a half, of no control, all of these tombs are opened and violated and the treasures extracted. This also, of course, without the presence of government and of official recorders and scribes. This represents the onset of a many dark ages. In other words, it's a period of time when no records are being kept. And so there's very little that we actually know or that we can know about this 125, 126 year period of time. So kind of a mini dark ages, so to speak. The question is, what caused this collapse? Yeah, Pepe was getting old. Pepe got very old. Probably couldn't do the Heb-Set festival anymore. Okay, if you remember that. But in any case, what caused the collapse? Because it wasn't just the fact that he got old and that his son was old. I mean, so just a new pharaoh take over as it had always in the past. So it causes a collapse. Well, what causes it is that ecological disaster that is too great for a weakened government to be able to contain and resolve. And that disaster comes in the form of drought. Now, the drought occurs in Central Africa, where the source of the Nile River was. And there we have a catastrophic drought that strikes the area. So this causes what had been made is now unmade. Again, introducing what we refer to as the first intermediate period. So the Nile, which had given so abundantly for so long, finally fails. Okay? Now the inundation upon which Egyptian society depended was so drastically reduced that it affected the entire Nile River Valley. Now the river didn't stop flowing, it didn't dry up, but it didn't flood any longer. No more abundant availability of water for irrigation and so on. And the thing that's almost unbelievable is that this drought in Central Africa, which is where the Nile originated, lasted for 20 to 30 years. If you can imagine the disaster that must have been for Egypt. So the images that you see there on the left must have been very typical of Egyptian agriculture during this period of time. Some evidence of this is Lake Fayoum. And Lake Fayoum is part of an oasis that you see there in that circle to the west of the Nile River. This was a very fertile area for a long time in Egyptian history, and Lake Fayoum, which had been replenished and fed by the Nile River, was a lake that was over 200 feet deep. And as we know from today, scientific investigation of this oasis and the lake, that lake completely dried up from evaporation. Gives us an idea of how catastrophic this drought must have been. 30 years of the Nile not overflowing its banks any longer. So even though there are no official records because government's gone, government has collapsed, there are poems and songs that still can be found today that do suggest the conditions that existed during this period of time. So nothing from official records, but folk songs and poems indicate basically how the common people viewed this period of time. And taking a look at the things that are said in those poems and songs, some of the conditions are robberies going unchecked, Now maybe that's the robberies that were involved with the looting of the tombs or whatever. Noble women, such as there still were, sold themselves into slavery because they had nothing to eat. The only way for them to survive was by selling themselves into slavery to warlords and gang leaders that still had some resources to enable them to survive. Grave sites were dug up and the bodies eaten for food, or people eating their own children. Now I would say that these are exaggerations, certainly, but still, the very fact that they show up in the lyrics of these poems and songs would indicate that there is something extremely disastrous going on in the area of Egypt. So, after 126 years, those monsoons begin to provide the rains in Central Africa that are going to provide for the flow of the Nile River. So if you remember back to our first lecture, when we talked about the movement of weather patterns. So it's at 10,000 BC, northern Africa and Egypt were all a lush grassland. And then the weather patterns moved southward until by 2500, everything had dried up. And so 2500 is the period of time that we're talking about here. So this is probably a consequence of that whole movement of weather patterns north and south as monsoons move north and then they move south again where they are today. And so this must have been part of that whole episode of drying out Egypt, basically. But fortunately for Egypt, the monsoons are restored and the river begins to flow normally again and begins to flood in its appointed pattern once again. And as a consequence, society begins to recover and the pharaohs are restored to power. So what we're going to see here is then the rise of what we call today the Middle Kingdom. So here's our timeline. We see early dynastic to Old Kingdom about 300 years. The Old Kingdom lasting for about 700 years. And then the Middle Kingdom is going to last, once pharaohs get reestablished, the Middle Kingdom will last for another approximately 500 years. So what happens here is that in the area of Thebes, now Thebes is this area in southern Egypt, the Upper Kingdom in the bend of the river is a city called Thebes. They're on the eastern bank of the Nile River. It is about 2000 BC or so that royal Theban princes would begin to gradually regain power in the south and begin to dominate the local nomarchs and gangs and warlords and establish themselves as the traditional royal power. So they established then, as a consequence of this, what's called the 11th dynasty. Now don't ask me what happened to the dynasties between the 6th and the 11th during that chaotic 126-year period, but nevertheless, this is the 11th dynasty. The pharaoh, the prince who establishes himself as the official pharaoh, is someone that will take the name of Mentuhotep I. Interestingly, Montu is the name of a war god, and Hotep simply means he's pleased. So the war god is pleased with this prince who makes himself pharaoh. So Mentuhotep I takes his army, collects together an army, and marches down the river, conquering as he goes, and conquers Lower Egypt, reuniting the entire river valley once again. So again, if you remember back to my first lecture, whenever conquest took place in reuniting the valley, it always happened from the south and moved north. From the hard-bitten, desert-raised soldiers of the south to the soft-living, easy-going folks of the delta, perhaps. Anyway, he takes his armies northward to Lower Egypt and reunites the valley under a single pharaoh once again, thus reestablishing the office of pharaoh. So with this, stability slowly begins to return to the entire valley. Also, royal portraits begin to appear, like we see here with the portrait of Mentuhotep. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here, of course, is by comparison to Khafre, there's a significant difference here in terms of quality. So these portraits were typically for a while very poorly crafted, and what that would suggest to us, of course, is that during that intermediate period, the royal workshops were, of course, not in use any longer, and the skills of the craftsmen declined significantly. So that now with the reestablishment of the pharaonic office and the reestablishment, the demand for royal portraits again, the artists have to relearn their skills, right? It's been a century and a half for the most part when they lost their skills. And so the royal artists of Mentuhotep are not as skillful as the artists of the Old Kingdom period. And you can see that, I think, fairly clearly in the simplicity and rather crude handling and carving of the royal portrait of Mentuhotep. Now, it's during the Middle Kingdom, the early part of the Middle Kingdom, that we will finally see the end of pyramid building altogether. However, Mentuhotep does build a rather remarkable tomb, a tomb whose design is going to reverberate down through the centuries, in fact. So let's take a look at that. We'll fly down here to look at the area across the river from Thebes in the western cliffs, a place called Deir el-Bahri, and it is here that Mentuhotep will have his tomb created. So not building a pyramid any longer, but rather this remarkable tomb here in the curve of the cliffs on the western side of the Nile. So here you see where the tomb is located. It's all in ruins today, but enough of it remains that we're able to discern basically what the structure was. So here's an aerial view of it. And you can see here's the main complex standing out here with a large structure in ruins in the middle of it, surrounded by columns. And then this portion dug back into the cliffs. Originally, the line of the cliffs would have gone along here, and Mentuhotep's workmen have carved back a section there, and in that is the entrance to his tomb. So this is an artist's recreation of the way that his tomb may have looked, something very different than what we have seen up to this point. Note, however, that it does still include a pyramid. However, it's a very small one, and so when you look at this structure right here, it looks like that's a hole right there, but in reality, that's the ruins of this little pyramid. So that's the shadow on the west side of the pyramid here. So the thing that's interesting is that here's the tomb. It's an underground tomb built down under this portion of the complex. But one of the things that's interesting about the design is this very unique series of colonnaded terraces. Now, how do we know that they look that way? Well, of course, we can't tell just by looking at the ruins, but the design of this tomb is going to be reflected centuries later in another very famous temple that will be built right next to this tomb that we'll take a look at when we get to the New Kingdom. So we believe that it featured this series of terraces topped by a small pyramid, and that these terraces were colonnaded. Now, how do we know they were colonnaded? Because we can see the remains of the colonnades here. Okay? So Mentuhotep introduces this very interesting design for his tomb. Now we come to Dynasty 12. So it is during the period of the 12th dynasty that the establishment returns to Egypt, so to speak. Now, it is a rather unusual circumstance, however, that initiates this return of the establishment, because it's a commoner that becomes pharaoh, proclaims himself pharaoh. He seizes the throne and establishes himself as first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. So his name is Amenemhet I. Now, some scholars believe that he may have been Montuhotep IV's vizier or advisor, royal court advisor. So we are fourth in the line now of Montuhotep's dynasty, and perhaps the vizier, for whatever reason, we don't know the circumstances, but he seizes the throne and establishes himself as the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhet I. Now he is a commoner, so he has no right to rule. He realizes this, though, and so he has a fake prophecy created to legitimize his rule, interestingly enough. Another thing that he does is moves the capital from Thebes in the south toward the north, toward the delta, and establishes his capital at that oasis of Fayum. Now, it is speculated today by scholars that perhaps he did that as a way of further legitimizing his rule, since it was a way perhaps of ingratiating himself to the people of Lower Egypt, people that were more sophisticated perhaps than those of that desert southern Egypt area, Upper Egypt. And the people of Lower Egypt were always somewhat suspicious of their uncultured country bumpkin cousins in the south at Thebes. So maybe this was a way of trying to ingratiate himself into the society of the more sophisticated northern Egyptians. He builds a very poor pyramid here, so he doesn't build a burial structure like Montuhotep I. He does build a pyramid, but you can see how very, very bad it is. Made of perishable materials like sun-dried mud brick, most of which have eroded today and makes it look almost like just a mound of dirt rather than a pyramid. Now, one unique practice that he establishes is that he makes his son, Sesostris I, a co-regent. That means that someone that is ruling at the same time that he is. Now, this is the first time that this has happened in Egyptian history. Co-regencies will continue throughout the rest of this 12th dynasty. And scholars today think that perhaps it was a way of maybe preventing the chaos of the intermediate era from reoccurring, because the pharaoh knows clearly who is going to succeed him and is trained in the practices of the pharaoh and is able to take over competently after him. So perhaps that's the reason for the co-regencies. Won't be the last time that co-regencies show up in Egypt, but this is the first time. So, stability and prosperity do begin to return now with the establishment of the 12th dynasty. An indication of that is the building of this so-called White Chapel. Called the White Chapel because it's built entirely of alabaster. And alabaster, of course, is a much more expensive material than limestone by far. And so the fact that this shrine has been built entirely of alabaster would suggest that prosperity and stability is beginning to return to the country. However, it doesn't seem to return for the pharaohs, at least, with the same level of pharaonic confidence, as you can see here in the portrait of Sesostris III. Now, it's badly damaged, of course, but you can tell that this portrait is significantly different, even though the skill levels have returned. The same skill levels that we saw in the Old Kingdom of the royal artists, the royal workshops, even though that has returned, we have a significantly different look here in the expression on the face of Sesostris III. Compare that to Khafre, of course, where you have that absolute and ultimate confidence in his power and security. So the suggestion in these portraits of the Middle Kingdom, with Sesostris III and others, we have an indication of a kind of a world weariness here that never existed in the official portraits of the Old Kingdom pharaohs. So is this an indication of actual troubles brewing in society where the pharaohs are not as established as they had been? Remember, they had been replaced by the nobles for 125 years or by warlords and gang leaders and so on. Maybe they were less confident and secure in their positions, and that might be reflected here in these portraits. But from our modern point of view, these are really quite expressive and interesting compared to these that have virtually no expression whatsoever in the facial features. Now, in the case of Sesostris III, maybe he didn't need to have been so worried. we do have his mummy, and that mummy shows that he stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. So towered head and shoulders over his citizens, right? Approximately a foot taller than anybody else in Egypt at the time. In any case, this 12th dynasty is going to end somewhat disastrously. It's going to end with a 4-year rule of a person by the name of Sobek Nephrou. This is the portrait of Sobek Nephrou, and you can tell that atypically what we have here is a female pharaoh. She is the first verifiably known female ruler of Egypt. Now, according to one Egyptologist, this is a sure indication of trouble brewing within society. The fact that a female can rule, because this is a position that has always been dominated by 1,000 years of the male gender. So how has a female come to rule Egypt? Well, according to this Egyptologist, it couldn't have happened unless things were in trouble. And of course, that is further evidence of trouble brewing or weakening of society that we saw in the poor structures of the pyramids. Okay, so Sobek Nephrou. I suspect that most of you have never heard of Sobek Nephrou, and when you think of a female pharaoh, you think of Hatshepsut, a much more famous individual, but she doesn't come along for hundreds of years yet. So what about Sobek Nephrou? Well, she wasn't just a commoner that came along and grabbed the throne. She was the wife of her brother, of course. Okay, pharaohs marry their sisters, right? And so she's the wife of her brother, Amenemhet IV. So he's the 4th in the line of this 12th dynasty. Now, he only rules for 9 years, but is unable to produce a male heir. So by the time he dies, the only person of royal lineage that's still there is Sobek Nephrou. And so she seizes the throne, basically. She takes over. But she only rules for 4 years. So not very long to influence anything, politics or history or anything else. And she pretty much disappears from history. The next dynasty, the 13th, is going to last for 154 years. So it's not like all of a sudden the Middle Kingdom just collapses. It's going to go on for another century and a half, but the 13th dynasty was a very weak one. They continued to build these pyramids, but as you can see, very small, very shabby mud brick pyramids, indicative again of decline. And then during the last 57 years of that dynasty, we have another dynasty that establishes itself in the delta. The 13th is ruling from Fayum, and the 14th will rule from the delta simultaneously. So for the last half century, you've got 2 dynasties ruling Egypt. So obviously, a little bit of confusion and chaos here. Certainly no strong pharaohs that are uniting the country under their guidance. Now, both dynasties are going to end in their simultaneous overthrow by the first invasion of Egypt by foreigners. So this will introduce then what's referred to as the Second Intermediate Period. This brings about the end of the Middle Kingdom that ends in the introduction of what we call the Second Intermediate Period. If you look at the date, you see it lasted about 200 years approximately. And this is the era of the coming of the Hyksos. Now, you may have heard of the Hyksos before, But they are a somewhat mysterious people. Scholars today know that they were Semites. These are people that came from the area of Canaan in the Middle East, same area where the Hebrews were living at this time. So keep in mind that, as we talked about back in the pyramids to begin with, Abraham, from whom the Hebrews descend, is believed to have lived about 2000 BC. So, if that's the case, it's 300 to 500 years the Hebrews have been living in Canaan. Well, the Hyksos are not Hebrews. Nobody knows who they are, but scholars are pretty convinced today that they were a Semitic people coming out of that area. Now, it used to be thought that Hyksos meant shepherd kings, which would imply that these were nomads, and would beg the question of how could nomads invade Egypt, this very sophisticated and ancient culture, and conquer it? Well, recently, scholars now believe that Hyksos, the word Hyksos means foreign chieftains or foreign kings or foreign rulers. So that's probably what Hyksos meant, not shepherd kings. Nevertheless, these were still probably a nomadic type of people. There's no evidence in the Near East of some great empire or some great kingdom of Hyksos that existed there prior to this period of time. So again, they remain a very mysterious and little understood people. Scholars still debate about who they were and where they came from. But nevertheless, it is during this period of time that that group of people gets together an army that is sufficient to cross the Sinai Desert and invade the Delta and conquer Lower Egypt. So they will ultimately set up a 15th dynasty of Hyksos rulers. So let's take a look quickly at the Hyksos here. There's not a whole lot to talk about relative to them because they didn't leave a lot of artifacts behind, a lot of evidences behind, but there is some. So the Egyptians are not strangers to Semites, people from Palestine or Canaan. They had been coming down into Egypt as traders for centuries of time. And so in this wall painting here, you can see a group of people leading a donkey laden with goods, produce, or whatever, trade items, and they're leading a donkey into Egypt. Now you can tell from their garments that they don't seem to be Egyptian. And so Egyptian artists paint foreigners with these other kind of clothing than what we see typical Egyptian being portrayed as wearing. Then in addition, they're all bearded. And so typically Egyptians indicate foreigners by different style of clothing and beards. But the point is that these Semitic traders had been coming from the area of Canaan for centuries, and so the Egyptians are not unfamiliar with them. However, this group, the so-called Hyksos, in around 1720, they invade across the Sinai and conquer the Lower Kingdom. And that begs the question, of course, is how were they able to do that? Well, we're at the era of Sesostris period of time, this Middle Kingdom period of time, so we take out Sesostris here and we bring in the Hyksos. Now remember, the Hyksos are in Egypt only primarily in the Delta. They did have some influence up the river, but for the most part they are established in the Delta area, the richest part of Egypt. Now how did they invade and conquer this ancient and powerful kingdom? Well, largely by using advanced weapons. So let me show you an example of standard Egyptian weapons at the time. So you've got this simple bow, adequate for hunting and that sort of thing, not very powerful. We've got the battle axe, and along with that, the mace, the battle mace, like we saw when we were talking about King Narmer. We saw an example of a battle mace there, ceremonial in that case, but a stick with a stone tied to the end of it. And then the stabbing sword, a simple stabbing sword. These were the typical weapons of the Egyptian military. Now what about the Hyksos? Well, they come in bringing with them the so-called sickle sword. So here we see the famous design of the sickle sword. Now this is not for stabbing, as you can clearly see. It doesn't have a point on it that's sufficient really for stabbing like a stabbing sword does. This, by the very design of it, is made for slashing, and so is a much more powerful weapon than the stabbing sword is, because you can swing with it with powerful blows as opposed to just poking with a stabbing sword. Now if you remember this sickle sword, remember our talk about Dwayne Johnson here in the Hollywood epic of the Scorpion King. Notice the sword that he's carrying. It is a sickle sword, right? And so I told you that that was an anachronism of that movie, chosen only because it's a powerful looking weapon. And so you're going to give that to the most powerful king of the period. That would be the Scorpion King. But remember, the Scorpion King, if that had been Narmer, it was 3000 BC. That's 2,000 years prior to the Middle Kingdom here. So this was after the time of King Narmer, but it makes for a cool sword for Hollywood in any case. Now also, instead of the simple bow, they had the so-called recurved bow. Now this is far more powerful, has much longer range, much more penetrating power than the simple bow that the Egyptians were using. So the recurve bow. So both of these weapons gave the Hyksos a real advantage over the Egyptian military. But the real killer, so to speak, was the horse and chariot. Now, many people are surprised by the fact that the Egyptians prior to the Hyksos did not have the horse. The Hyksos bring the horse into Egypt. And so they bring it in a devastating manner, pulling a war chariot. And these were like Egyptian-era battlefield tanks. They just simply rolled over everybody. The Egyptians had no defense against this sort of weapon. And so with the sickle sword, the recurved bow, and the horse and chariot, the Hyksos conquer the delta and establish themselves as rulers of Lower Egypt. Now after the Hyksos are driven out, after 150 years or so, then the Egyptians are going to make excellent use of horse and chariot themselves. But during this period of time, it was one of the things that brought about their conquest. Okay, so once the Hyksos settle in the delta, they will adopt Egyptian ways, interestingly enough, and establish what is called the 15th dynasty. They will build a capital city, but they will build it in the delta at a place called Avaris. So this is where it's located, in the eastern delta. And just by comparison, that's where Memphis, the traditional Egyptian capital of Lower Egypt, would be. So the Hyksos established themselves at Avaris in the delta. Now, they will adopt, interestingly enough, Egyptian lifestyle and culture. So here, for example, you see cartouches produced by Hyksos pharaohs. Now, how do we know that they are not Egyptian cartouches? Well, the design is far cruder than what we see from Egyptians, plus the names are not Egyptian names. They're Hyksos type names of the pharaohs. What we see here is an artwork that's much more crude than Egyptian artwork. Also, another difference is that they worshipped something called the Seth animal, which you see here in relief. So the Seth animal, is it associated with Seth, the deceiver, the schemer of the Osiris legend? I quite frankly don't know, but nevertheless, they worshipped the Seth animal. Here's another indication of it in this beautiful pectoral, where we have the Wedjat, typically Egyptian, right, but a little cruder version. And we have Horus here, whose head in this case is not attached to a hawk's body, but to the Seth animal's body, and then of course the Seth animal here. So they worship the Seth animal and set themselves apart somewhat from the Egyptians, although they did adopt Egyptian ways. Now, one of the other ways that they set themselves apart from the Egyptians is that foreigners were welcomed to the royal Hyksos court. Now we say this is different from the traditional Egyptians because typically Egyptians were somewhat suspicious of foreigners. They had never been invaded before, having been protected by the deserts that surrounded them, and so was one of the reasons that they were able to develop the way they did, insulated from outside influences. And so they kind of developed a suspicion of foreigners. But when it comes to the Hyksos, they are foreigners. And so foreigners seem to have been welcomed to the royal Hyksos court. This is indicated in one way by some frescoes that have been recovered, and these are very rare and very fragile because the delta, the moist nature of the delta is not kind to ancient structures. But here we have a fragment of a fresco, and those of you that have studied the Eastern Mediterranean cultures might recognize this figure performing what appears to be a rather energetic acrobatic move. And if you look at the costuming and also the hairstyle here, that might remind you of people that dominated Crete in the Eastern Mediterranean for a very long time during this same period of time. So here you see a recreation based on other fragments that were recovered from Avaris, and you can see clearly here a representation of what was bull leaping, known as bull leaping on Crete from the Knossos Palace. And so these fragments would certainly indicate that Minoan artists were present at the Hyksos court. Now we don't have any literary evidence of that, and only a vague amount of artistic evidence, but some evidence is there. So it's kind of an interesting idea that Minoan artists are present at the Hyksos court. Further indication of that is that a Hyksos cartouche, like you see up here, a Hyksos cartouche was actually found at the Palace of Knossos on Crete. So, interesting implication. Now the last thing I want to cover here is this the era, perhaps, of a Semitic lord in Egypt? Well, of course, the Hyksos are Semites, but we have a very interesting indication of someone of Semitic extraction, a Hebrew, that rises to power in Egypt, becomes the second most powerful man after the pharaoh in ancient Egypt during some period of time. So there is some indication, as stated in Genesis, the book of Genesis, chapter 41, of a great Hebrew lord in Egypt. So these are the verses. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Joseph, of course, being a Hebrew, descendant of Abraham. So Pharaoh says unto Joseph, Thou shalt be over my house. Only in the throne shall I be greater than thou. For I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his signet ring and put it on Joseph's hand, which was an indication of power and approval and authority, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. The gold chain also an indication of authority. Now, this raises a very interesting question that has been debated for years between biblical scholars and secular scholars. Biblical scholars that want to believe the story that is being told in Genesis, and secular scholars dismisses Genesis and the whole story of the Hebrews in Egypt, that eventually become the slaves in Egypt, dismisses that whole story as a fabricated tale of a later era. But given the traditional suspicions that Egyptians had of foreigners, and the fact that a foreign invader, the Hyksos, from Canaan, had conquered the lower kingdom, what was this all about? Why would an Egyptian pharaoh take a foreigner, a Hebrew, someone that maybe have been related to the Hyksos that had conquered the lower kingdom, and raise that individual to be second in command of all of Egypt? So what was that story in Genesis all about? Well, this is an interesting possibility, and that is, could that story of Joseph the Hebrew have taken place during the Hyksos era. Because in Genesis, there's no indication of when it took place, what years it took place. So, given these conditions, is it possible that the story of Joseph being raised to second in command under the Egyptian pharaoh could have taken place in the Hyksos era when the Egyptian pharaoh was a Hixos? Then there wouldn't have been the same bias and reluctance to take someone of Semitic extraction and make him second in command because of his abilities that he had proven to have. So we'll talk more about that in our next lecture. So I'll see you then.